Hi, I'm Adam Summer. You're listening to the Yerushalmi Talk podcast with the support of the Yeshivat Javar Yerushalayim in Har Nof, Jerusalem. This is Peah, Chapter 6, Halacha 1 continued. This is part 2 of the shiur. The Gemara is going to get into this thing of this time-limited Hefker and time-limited Hefker declarations. And as we know, there's a disagreement between Bet Hillel and Bet Shammai on it, so we're going to see those opinions come up later in the shiur. The Gemara reads, until now, we know only about the law where one declared his produce Hefker for an extended period of time. But what is the law if he declared his produce Hefker for just a short period of time? In other words, what they're asking is, does it remain exempt from tithes even if the owner himself acquires it, as is normally the law with regards to Hefker? So we were talking about, longer term Hefker declarations. Now we're talking about these shorter term ones. So basically declaring an article Hefker for a limited time basically means that the article is going to be made available for everyone, but only during that period of time. Now, if somebody takes possession of the article during that period of time, he's acquired it, and that's forever. Otherwise, the article automatically goes back to the owner. So we're talking about a thing where you're saying, okay, I'm going to leave this out. I'm going to leave these bottles of wine out for 3 days, and if nobody comes and acquires them, they revert back to me. It's this kind of declaration. We were looking at longer term declarations where they're just, leaving it, Hefker, and, somebody comes and acquires it, they acquire it. In the case here, where it says, okay, until now we know only about a law where one declared his produce Hefker for an extended period of time. But what is a law if he declared his produce Hefker for just a brief period of time? So according to what Rabbi Meir was holding, he's holding that an item that was declared Hefker becomes ownerless at once, automatically. As soon as he declares it, it's Hefker. It's ownerless. And so if you're leaving produce Hefker, then that produce is permanently exempt from Meiser, even if the owner comes to reacquire it by the view of Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Yossi's view, which we were talking about yesterday in part 1 of this shiur, Rabbi Yossi's view is that an object that was declared Hefker does not become ownerless unless it is acquired by another party. So if someone declares his produce Hefker and then he reacquires it, that Meiser obligation remains in force, since the produce never really left the owner's possession to begin with. This is all a question of, when you declare something Hefker, when does it leave your possession? Is it leaving your possession upon being declared Hefker, or is it leaving your possession when somebody takes it? So one of the subtleties here is that it might be that you're making the Hefker, according to what Rabbi Yossi is saying, is that you didn't lose possession of it, but you made it so that other people can take possession of it, that it's still yours, but that other people have the right to acquire it. That's effectively what Rabbi Yossi is saying, and that only that act of acquisition, once you've given him the right to acquire it, that's when it transfers. So this question now really is not relevant to Rabbi Yossi's view at all. Rabbi Yossi's view, it's obvious that, if you, left produce and you declared it Hefker, and then it's reacquired by the original owner, it's going to remain subject to the Meiser obligation. But the Gemara is really going to be asking about Rabbi Meir's view, and he's ruling that the produce that was declared Hefker is going to be generally exempt from Hefker, even if the owner comes to reacquire it. And this is going to allow an exemption, and it allows this exemption even with the short-term Hefker declarations as well. So the Rosh Cirillo points out that the reason the exemption might not apply in this case is perhaps because of the concern that the owner takes the produce under these circumstances, and it would be misconstrued as a retraction of his Hefker declaration, and that would leave, if he retracted it, that would leave the Meiser obligation intact. Rather, the new acquisition of the property excludes the Hefker property from the Meiser when it's in this state of ownerlessness. So the Gemara is going to try to resolve Rabbi Meir's point, and if you're going to leave it like this, by the way, you have certainly within 3 days of leaving it, Hefker, you have room for people to play games with. So what's going to be the answer? The Gemara is going to answer. Gemara says, let us resolve the inquiry from the end of the following Baraisa. If one declared his field ownerless for 2 or 3 days after, he may retract his declaration. And in explanation of this Baraisa, Rabbi Shimon Diyama taught in the presence of Rabbi Zera, he may retract his declaration even shortly after 3 days have passed. So this is going to be a dispute between Rabbi Shimon Diyama and Rabbi Zera. So let's unpack this. Rosh Cirillo has a great explanation about it, and here's what he says. He says, this Baraisa is returning to a standard Hefker declaration that is not limited to any particular span of time. It teaches that within the first 3 days after a field has been declared ownerless, the owner has the option to recant and nullify his declaration. The Mara Fulda points out in Bavli Nedarim 45a, where there's a similar Baraisa, not exactly the same, but similar. The Gemara explains, it's Bavli Nedarim. The Gemara explains that this rule was enacted by the rabbis to counter the subterfuge employed by cheaters who would declare their fields Hefker and then reclaim them in order to free their produce from the Meiser obligation. Since it was their intention at the very moment they were declaring the Hefker to reclaim the fields, the Hefker was no more than a charade and never really valid. And to deter such conduct, the rabbis decreed that every Hefker declaration, even one sincerely meant, could be retracted for up to 3 days if someone else had already taken possession of the property. The field's produce thus remained subject to Meiser during that period, even if the field was acquired by someone other than the one who declares it ownerless, and since the Hefker has not yet become finalized. So Mara Fulda continues, says, hence, if the original owner should reclaim his field any time during the first 3 days, which is what someone employing subterfuge would do, it would be understood that his action constitutes a retraction of his Hefker, thereby nullifying it and leaving the Meiser obligation intact. So let's say, we return to the previous case in chapter 5, where you have the leket pile, the 1 year of leket, and you have the grain and it gets mixed up. So you say, okay, well, why doesn't the farmer just leave it Hefker, leave everything Hefker, reacquire it? And the point here is that the rabbis made it so that you can't, because it's really a charade, and you're really doing it to get out of Meiser obligation. And so it's still subject to the Meiser obligation, so you really didn't fix anything at all in that case. That's the point here, is that you would have people playing games. They'd come, they'd declare everything Hefker for 10 minutes, they'd reacquire it, presto, they don't have to give any Meiser anymore. So they know that cheaters are going to go do that. And so they made a rule that it's not a valid, that it's not really an acquisition. It's not really a transfer of property into ownerlessness. What they said was that you really just retracted the Hefker declaration, nullified it, so that you didn't really reacquire this. That's what they're saying. They're saying you didn't go and reacquire this thing that you left Hefker. All you did was nullify it. And so therefore, because you didn't actually acquire it, you just nullified it, it's still liable for Meiser. That's the point of the rabbis. Rosh Cirillo, by the way, there's a parallel text in Yerushalmi Nedarim, chapter 4, Halacha 10. And basically, there's a little bit difference, but basically here's what it says over there. It says, Rabbi Zera said, the Brisa says, this I'm reading from Yerushalmi Nedarim 4:10. You can see a similar one in Bavli Nedarim 44a, but it's similar. It's a little bit different. Brisa says that only that one may retract his Hefker declaration during the first 3 days. This implies that after the first 3 days have passed, he cannot retract his declaration. In other words, says the Mara Fulda, the Rosh Cirillo, he's explaining that Rabbi Zera is inferring from this brisa that once 3 days have gone, the Hefker declaration is considered final and can no longer be retracted. And even if no one had yet taken possession of the property, it's still final. And the reason for this is that the people who planned to reclaim their fields that they had fraudulently declared Hefker do not wait more than 3 days before doing so. The Rosh Cirillo continues, and it says that the reason for this is that the people who plan to reclaim the fields they had fraudulently declared Hefker do not wait more than 3 days before doing so, and once 3 days have passed without the owner retraction, there is no further concern that the declaration was made insincerely. The original Hefker declaration therefore stands, and the owner has no authority to undo it. The Ron says, should the original owner of the field reacquire it at that point, he is considered to have made a new acquisition and not a retraction of the earlier Hefker. So sometimes we see people trying to fix things for biur reasons, where they're leaving things out as Hefker to go and reacquire it. And what this Yerushalmi is pointing out is that you didn't make a valid Hefker declaration. All you did was retract it. So really, because it didn't go into Hefker, that your fix is not really a fix. That everything is still going to be subject to Meiser, and it might not be nullified at all because you didn't acquire it. Because in biur you have to leave it out for anybody to acquire it. But because your neder is being retracted by the rabbis, that because it's retracted, it's not an acquisition. So you actually didn't fix it. And that would be the case here, that you actually did not retract this declaration. They put a thing after 3 days because now, before 3 days, they have a thing that if somebody else comes and acquires it, that the person has 3 days to declare, to change his mind and declare to get his property back. But after 3 days, this is something that the rabbis did. After 3 days, that's a permanent thing. And so they're saying, Rabbi Zera's point is saying, likewise, after 3 days, just like anybody can come and take it and it's theirs, same with that person, he can come and take it. And so what that's trying to do is that's trying to limit and cut down the amount of fraud and cheating that can occur in Am Yisrael. How clever are the sages? So the Gemara is, to sum up, the Gemara reads, let us resolve from the inquiry from the end of the following brisa. If one declared his field ownerless for 2 or 3 days after, he may retract his declaration. And Rabbi Shimon ben Diama taught in the presence of Rabbi Zera, he may retract his declaration even shortly after 3 days have passed. So the question is, what on earth is Rabbi Shimon Diyama asking? Okay, what is he asking? So let's look at the Pnei Moshe for some help. Pnei Moshe says Rabbi Shimon Diyama is asserting that the 2 or 3 days mentioned in the Brisa are meant only as an example, not an absolute time frame, and in reality he can retract his Hefker declaration even sometime after the 3 days have passed. So that's a big departure from what we were talking about. In other words, Rabbi Shimon Diyama is saying that the 2 or 3 days are not absolute 2 or 3 days, just an example, and you shouldn't be looking at it as a hekesh to apply it to. He's saying that you should apply it as a hekesh to apply to all other passages of time, not just 2 or 3 days. And so it's really just an example. He's arguing it's a hekesh. Rabbi Zera is going to be arguing that no, it's not a hekesh. That it's not a hekesh that's going to apply from that you can say, oh, from these 2 or 3 days it applies to all other periods of time. That this 3-day period of time is a hard thing. It's not just an example, but that's a real limit. So the Mara Fulda is going to help us out. He's going to say, apparently Rabbi Shimon Diyama held that the rabbis were concerned about the possibility of cheating, even in cases where the owner waits longer than 3 days to reclaim his field, and they therefore allowed a Hefker declaration to be retracted even more than 3 days had elapsed since the declaration was made. That's the point of Rabbi Shimon Diyama. In other words, it's unclear at what point Rabbi Shimon Diyama would consider a Hefker declaration to be final and retractable, but that's the point that he's making, that a Hefker declaration, for it to be retracted, even more than 3 days have elapsed, that it can be 5 days, 10 days, perhaps even a year. What is going to be the limit for Diyama when the Hefker declaration will be final and unretractable? No idea, no clue. So that's the point of Rabbi Shimon Diyama, and I guess it's a straw man argument because Rabbi Zera comes to respond and to clarify it. So I think Rabbi Shimon Diyama is being used here as a straw man argument to set up one opposing view of what it could be, that, hey, any period of time, it's still retractable, even, say, 6 months later. Rabbi Zera comes and says to him in response that once you say that a Hefker declaration may be retracted even after 3 days have passed, the law should be the same whether the declaration was retracted after 3 days have passed or whether it was retracted after many more than 3 days have passed. And this is surely untrue. So the Mara Fulda is explaining here that Rabbi Zera responds to Rabbi Shimon Diyama as follows. According to your assertion that a Hefker declaration can be retracted beyond the first 3 days, it should just as well be possible for one to retract his declaration even after numerous days or years have gone by. And as there is no reason to differentiate between one case and another, but Rabbi Zera is saying, says the Mara Fulda, that this is certainly impossible, for the entire concept of Hefker would be meaningless. Thus, argues Rabbi Zera, says the Pnei Moshe, the Baraisa must mean that a Hefker declaration can be retracted only within the first 3 days and not afterwards. Only then does the Baraisa's ruling have a plausible explanation, namely that the concern for subterfuge is limited to the first 3 days. So I like that interpretation, and we're going to get now some support for Rabbi Zera's argument. Clearly, one's ability to retract an ordinary Hefker declaration does not extend at all beyond the rabbinically ordained 3-day period of time. And let's go look at some support for Rabbi Zera's argument for the latter portion. In other words, Rabbi Shimon Diama is saying that this 3-day limit that the rabbis are talking about, that this is a hekesh that should be read as an example for all periods of time, and that it should be whether it's 4 days, 5 days, 6 months, 1 year, whatever. He's saying that the rabbis are just putting an arbitrary period of time to show that you can always come and reclaim your Hefker, and that it's always reclaimable. Rabbi Zera is saying, no, that 3-day period of time that the rabbis put down, that's not an accidental thing. That's actually the limit. And after that 3-day period of time, it's unredeemable. In other words, you can't say, oh, I take it back, I cancel the Hefker. You can't. It's Hefker. You can go try to acquire it, but if somebody else acquires it, you don't get your stuff back. So the Gemara reads, the language for this second half of the Brisa supports the argument of Rabbi Zera. What is the second half? Here's what it says. It says, in what instance was it said that one may retract his Hefker declaration within 3 days? When he declared an item Hefker without specifying any time limit. But if he declared, let my field be Hefker for 1 day, or for 1 week, or for 1 month, or for 1 year, or for 1 7-year period, the law is as follows. As long as neither he nor anyone else has taken possession of it, he can retract his declaration. But once either he or anyone else has taken possession of it, he cannot retract his declaration. So, from the fact that, just as an explanation, the fact that the first part of the Brisa regarding the ordinary Hefker declaration mentions 2 or 3 days and does not supply a broader range of examples like what we just listed, it's inferring, says Rabbi Zera, that the 3 days is in fact an absolute limit for when retraction of ordinary Hefker declarations are made. So it's saying that, hey, here's a general rule for Hefker. If you're not putting in a time limit to say, okay, this is Hefker for 2 days, or this is Hefker for 6 months, or this is Hefker for a week, if it's an ordinary Hefker declaration that says, okay, this is Hefker, that the rabbis are putting in a 3-day period of time. And why are they doing that? Why are they putting in a 3-day period of time? Because they don't want people to come and leave it for Hefker for 10 seconds, acquire it, and then say, oh, it's free from Meiser. What they're saying is, within that 3-day period of time, that if you come and you reacquire it, you simply retracted your Hefker declaration. You didn't acquire anything. Big difference. You did not make a kinyan. You simply retracted your statement. And why does that matter? So then they're coming and they're saying, all right, well, if Mr. Poor person comes and acquires this 1 day after for this general Hefker declaration, that the farmer can get his property back if it's acquired within 3 days. Because they're saying, okay, this period of time is a freedom period where nobody really acquires it. All that happens is if the person wants it back, he can get it back because he's just nullifying this. And after 3 days, anyone can get it. That it's no longer a nullification of a vow, it's no longer a nullification of a statement, that is really a true kinyan. And that's why they're putting it in. And they're trying to make sure that these are, first of all, real Hefker statements. They're not games. And the second thing is to protect the property of the Levim and the Kohanim from people cheating and trying to take crops and all sorts of produce out of circulation and exempting it from Meiser with these games, and thereby diminishing the amount that really would belong to the tribe of the Levim and the tribe of the Kohanim. So this is something else that they're thinking about. The Mara Fulda is gonna bring out another point. Okay, that the later part of this Brisa is teaching that although the rabbis enacted a rule allowing Hefker declarations to be retracted for up to 3 days, even if someone else has taken possession of them, in order to avoid the possibility of subterfuge, they did not do so for a time-limited Hefker. And this is because anyone declaring his field Hefker merely to circumvent the Meiser obligation would not bother to attach a time limit, since he was planning to take his field back immediately in any case. Pnei Moshe points out that it was assumed that anyone declaring the field Hefker for a fixed period of time is doing so sincerely, and thus it precluded the need for any special retraction period. The Ron points out that the only issue in the case of a time-limited Hefker is whether someone has taken possession of the property, and if no one has done so, the owner can retract his Hefker even after 3 days. If someone has taken possession of the property, the owner may not retract his Hefker even within 3 days. So that's the point, is that in a defined period of time, let's say somebody comes along and you make Hefker for something for 1 week, and then somebody acquires it 2 days later. Well, according to what the Ron is pointing out in his commentary Nedarim 44a, Bavli, that's a real acquisition, because they're saying that this is a real sincere Hefker declaration. That's also a real sincere acquisition. So let's look at the Pnei Moshe for some help here on understanding Rabbi Meir's point. So at first glance, the ruling seems to follow the view of Rabbi Yossi that an item declared Hefker does not leave the owner's possession until someone actually acquires it. That's the point of Rabbi Yossi. But, says Pnei Moshe, the truth, however, is that the Baraita's ruling is consistent with Rabbi Meir's view as well. Well, that's really interesting. How so? And here's what he says. He says, for when Rabbi Meir stated that an item that was declared Hefker leaves the owner's possession immediately, he was referring only to ordinary Hefker declarations. But in the case of a time-limited Hefker, Rabbi Meir agrees that the owner may later retract his declaration. And the reason for this distinction is that the owner's reluctance to permanently let go of his property indicates that he wishes to leave himself the option of retracting his declaration. In other words, we should assume that he made the property Hefker on the condition that he should be able to retroactively nullify his declaration as long as no one has yet taken possession of the property. And that, by the way, also follows the idea of the Ron's commentary in 44a in Bavli Nedarim. So Rosh Cirillo points out, the Baraita states that once someone has taken possession of the field from its state of Hefker, even if that person is the owner himself, the Hefker declaration can no longer be retracted. And what that means is that if the owner takes possession of the field as an acquisition from Hefker, rather than simply retracting his original declaration, in other words, he made an acquisition, he made a kinyan. So what that means is that the Hefker is considered to have been fully valid, and the field's produce is exempt from the Meiser obligation. For in contrast to retracting a declaration of Hefker, which means that the field was never ownerless, and its produce is therefore subject to Meiser, reacquiring a field from a state of Hefker means that the field was ownerless for a brief period of time, and its produce is therefore exempt from Meiser even after it's been reacquired. But keep in mind that in that case you made a real Hefker and a real sincere thing where other people can really come and take it. So that's something to keep in mind. It's not just a cosmetic thing for a game. Gemara is gonna go over various issues that are resolved by this brisa, including what we were talking about in part 1 of this video. So the brisa informs us, says the Gemara, that the law regarding produce that was declared Hefker for an extended period of time is the same as the law regarding produce that was declared Hefker for a brief period of time. And in both cases, the produce remains exempt from tithes, even if the owner himself reacquires it. So what does the Rosh Hashanah say about this? He explains about this brisa, that the brisa puts a time limit Hefker declaration in a single category. So if a field was declared Hefker for 1 day, that has the same law as a field that's declared Hefker for 7 years. So basically they're pointing out there's two kinds of Hefker declarations. One's for a period of time where you're saying, I'm leaving this to be Hefker for 7 years. And then there's the other one where it says, I'm leaving this to be Hefker. And then you have this 3-day period of time, and then thereafter it can be acquired. So in all cases, says the Rosh Hashanah, the Hefker is sufficiently effective to make retraction impossible, thus exempting the field's produce from the Meiser obligation once someone has taken possession of the field, even if that person is the original owner. And this resolves the Gemara's initial question, says the Rosh Hashanah. So let's move on in the Gemara. It says that in both cases, the produce remains exempt from tithes, even if the owner himself reacquires it. So the Gemara says, furthermore, this brisa informs us that in the case of a limited time Hefker declaration, the rabbis were not concerned for a subterfuge. In other words, if you're saying, okay, this is Hefker for 7 years, they weren't worried about it. For a subterfuge, they're saying that this is a real, sincere Hefker, and that if he intends... Well, let's look at the note by the Vilna Gaon. The Vilna Gaon says, from this brisa, it's clear that even if somebody declared his field Hefker for a single day and then immediately required it, the Hefker is considered to be fully effective, and the field's produce is exempt from Meiser. This shows us that with respect to time-limited Hefker declarations, the rabbis were not apprehensive that the owner declared his field ownerless only because he intended to reclaim it and thereby exempt the produce from Meiser. So there's a big difference when you take your bottles of wine out and you want to, it's a Shvius year and you want to leave them out to, satisfy the Bure obligation, and you say, okay, these are Hefker. Well, according to that statement, and then you reacquire them, you didn't really acquire them. You didn't acquire them. All you did is you did it within the 3-day period of time, and it's not an acquisition. You've nullified your vow. But if you're really making it a real Hefker, you say, okay, these are Hefker for 3-day period of time, and anyone who comes and collects it, that's a final Hefker. Big difference, says the rabbis. So this reads here, the Gemara reads, the brisa informs us that in the case of a time-limited Hefker declaration, rabbis were not concerned for a subterfuge. And it continues and says, it further informs us that a person can declare his produce Hefker and then reacquire it for himself, thereby exempting the produce from the tithing obligation. And finally, says the Gemara, it confirms the accuracy of Rabbi Zera's question to Rabbi Shimon Diama. For Rabbi Zera says that with regard to retracting an ordinary Hefker declaration beyond the first 3 days, the law is the same whether a lengthy time or a brief time has elapsed, says the Gemara. So, just a quick point here by the Maro Fulda. The Gemara is now emphasizing that Rabbi Zera's position is supported by the wording in the later part of the brisa, which refers to a wide spectrum of time frames, like 1 day, 1 week, 6 months, 7 years, and as it implies that the brisa's initial ruling regarding the retraction period for ordinary Hefker declarations means a 2-day or 3-day period specifically. So let's summarize this with the Rosh Hashanah and his help. Rosh Hashanah says, to summarize this law, according to Rabbi Meir, as it emerges from this discussion, a standard open-ended Hefker declaration may be retracted during the first 3 days, even if someone has already taken possession of the produce that was declared Hefker once the 3 days have passed, and the declaration is no longer retractable after that 3-day period has passed. So now if somebody acquires it, that is really Hefker, and it's a kinyan, and it's there. So the produce is therefore exempt from Meiser, and even if the owner acquires it then, after that 3 days, that is a real acquisition and is really exempt from Meiser. And by contrast, points out, the Meforish says that, by contrast, the time-limited Hefker declaration, regardless of its stated interval, may be retracted indefinitely, thus keeping the produce subject to Meiser, as long as no one yet has acquired the produce. Once another party, or even the owner himself, takes possession of the produce, the Hefker declaration can no longer be retracted, even within the 3 days, and the produce is exempt from Hefker. I want to point out something from the Vilna Gaon. Vilna Gaon explains the Gemara a little bit differently, and he's explaining the Gemara like this. Here's what the Vilna Gaon says about this. Vilna Gaon says that the Gemara is inquiring whether the time-limited Hefker declarations are effective at all. In other words, since the entire concept of voluntary Hefker is derived either from the law of Peah and Leket or from the law of Shemitah, which is what we were talking about, the Vilna Gaon is pointing out that perhaps a Hefker declaration can therefore be effective only if there is no associated time limit, just like Peah, Leket, and Shemitah produce, which are forever ownerless and available for acquisition. So the Vilna Gaon continues, and he says that the Gemara's first Baraisa, where it should be read as follows. It should be read that if one declared his field ownerless for 2 or 3 days, he may retract his declaration. So Vilna Gaon continues, it says, the point of this ruling is that Rabbi Meir, who holds that an article that was declared Hefker generally becomes ownerless immediately, and agrees in the case of a time-limited Hefker that the original owner leaves himself the option of retracting his declaration before the article has been acquired. The Vilna Gaon continues and says that the Gemara then presents a discussion between Rabbi Shimon Diama and Rabbi Zera about whether this allowance to retract applies to all time-limited Hefker declarations, or just those that are for 3 days or less. And a proof for the former position is from the second Baraisa, says the Vilna Gaon, which indicates that all time-limited Hefker declarations, regardless of the length, can be retracted as long as no one has yet taken possession of the property. In any event, it is clear from the above that the time-limited Hefker declarations are, in fact, effective, thus resolving the Gemara's initial inquiry. So that's the note by the Vilna Gaon on how he's interpreting this. Now we're going to get on to the next statement in the Mishnah, very short, finish it up, and it's going to get into Bet Shammai. The Mishnah's later statement says, if all the sheaves of the field are each the size of one calf, and one is 4 calves, and they forgot that one large one, so Bet Shammai is holding that it is not shchicha, and Bet Hillel is holding that it is shchicha. So the Gemara now is going to try to determining the reason behind Bet Shammai's ruling. Gemara reads, what are we dealing with? I.e., in other words, what is Bet Shammai's reasoning for exempting this large sheaf from shchicha? Gemara reads, it is because such a relatively large sheaf constitutes something distinctive, then it should suffice for it to be merely 2 calves in size. So here's what the Mara Fulda explains for us to understand it. He's saying that Bet Shammai is saying that this oversized sheaf, being 4 times larger than the rest, stands out among all the others. So even if it was temporarily overlooked by the owner, he will certainly remember it sooner or later because it's so big. And this might be grounds to exclude it from the purview of shkichika, for we'll learn in the Mishnah later in chapter 7 that something which possesses a feature that will cause a person to eventually remind himself of it is not considered forgotten. And the point, says the Mara Fulda of Bet Shammai, is that this is so big that it has this quality of it having a distinctive feature which will remind him of it and not consider it to be forgotten. So the Vilna Gaon points out the following. He says about this, he says, if a sheaf can be considered distinctive on account of its large size relative to the other sheaves of the field, in other words, this is 4 times bigger. For whatever reason, they made it 4 times bigger. That is basically going to be considered to be distinctive. So the Vilna Gaon explains that this designation should apply even to a sheaf that is merely twice the size of the others. So why would Bet Shammai require it to be 4 times as large to be exempt? That's the question by the Vilna Gaon, and it's a very good question. In other words, why not 2 times as big? I mean, that's also distinctive. Why does it have to be 4 times as big? What's the point of that? So it should be, so the Gemara, let's read this again. The Gemara says, what are we dealing with here? It is because such a relatively large sheaf constitutes something distinctive. Then it should suffice for it to be merely 2 calves in size. And if Bet Shammai's reason is that the oversized sheaf has the status of a row because we view it as though it were divided into 4 separate sheaves of 1 calf each, then it would suffice for it to be merely 3 calves in size. So why, in other words, why on earth is Bet Shammai requiring it to be as large as 4 of the other sheaves? Where are they getting this from? Penei Moshe says the following. Penei Moshe says, the Gemara is proposing that since each of the field's sheaves measure a single calf, we ought to view a 4-calf sheaf as if it were composed of 4 individual sheaves. And this would put it in the same category as a row of consecutive sheaves, which does not become shkichika if forgotten. So in other words, says the Penei Moshe, that if you're taking 4 individual ones that are basically connected as a row, that this also is distinctive because it's a row. And so this row doesn't become forgotten. That they all basically work together as a row to save each other from becoming forgotten individually. And that's why, says the Penei Moshe, is coming up with 4. Mara Fulda says like this. Mara Fulda says, if Bet Shammai's view that the large sheaf, that it would be as though it were divided into individual 1-calf bundles, then even if the sheaf were only 3 times the size of the others, it should be exempt from shkichika since 3 sheaves constitute a row, says the Mara Fulda. So why then does Bet Shammai require to be 4 times as large as the others? That's a very good question, and the Gemara is going to answer that. Gemara reads, one of the rabbinical students stated this following an explanation of Rabbi Yochanan in the presence of Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish. And here's what it says. It says, Bet Shammai exempted from shkichika any sheaf that one can divide and make into a row, with a row being defined as 4 sheaves in accordance with Bet Shammai's own opinion later on in this chapter. So the Mara Fulda says like this, and then I'll explain it by the Vilna Gaon. Mara Fulda says, the Gemara answers that Bet Shammai indeed holds that we view the large sheaf as though it were divided into separate 1-calf sheaves. And the reason they require that this sheaf be 4 times as large as the other sheaves is that they follow their own opinion in the Mishnah in Halacha 4, in chapter 6, Halacha 4, that only a set of 4 sheaves or more is exempt from shkichika. This is in opposition of Bet Hillel's opinion that even a set of 3 sheaves are exempt. So according to Bet Shammai, 3 consecutive sheaves do not qualify a row, and are not exempt from shchicha. So the Rosh Cirillo points out that Bet Hillel states in this Mishnah that even a sheaf of 4 calves is subject to shchicha, and this is because they do not accept Bet Shammai's presence that a large sheaf is viewed as though it were divided into smaller bundles. Rather, Bet Hillel holds that it must be treated as a single sheaf that it actually is. And it follows that according to Bet Hillel, even a sheaf that is 6, 7, or 8 times as large as the other sheaves is treated as an individual sheaf and thus subject to the shchicha, in other words, up to a maximum of 2 seah, 12 kav, which is exempt for a different reason. So this kind of gets into what we were talking about the other day. What happens if you have a case where you have the final bundle of all the sheaves collected before it goes for transport to the threshing floor, and over in this other part of the pile, you're collecting some of the piles, and you have, say, 4 of these sheaves together, and then you're going to go transport it over to the great pile. But first you have a big pile that's definitely bigger than individual sheaves, and you put a few of these together. So the point of Bet Shammai is that, no, it's like you can take these apart, and it's as if it's a row. And we are, by the way, counting a row as 4. Bet Hillel says, no, that this hasn't been brought to the great pile yet. No, even though it's very large, it has to at least be 12 of these, and that anything less is not significant enough. It still counts as an individual sheaf, and it can still be forgotten until the point it's brought into the great pile, that great pile that's going to be loaded on for transport. So according to Bet Hillel and his opinion over there, that would be the case where if you're making this intermediary big pile, that can still be forgotten. So the Vilna Gaon, the point by the Vilna Gaon here on this, he's saying that the Gemara's original question is quite enigmatic. The Vilna Gaon says, the Gemara was certainly aware that Bet Shammai's view in the Mishnah below in Halacha 4, chapter 6, Halacha 4, is that only a row of 4 sheaves is exempt from shchicha. Why then does the Gemara contend that if a large sheaf is viewed as separate 1 calf bundles, according to Bet Shammai, that it should be exempt even if it is merely 3 times the size of the other sheaves? Gemara is going to amend the text of the Gemara's question to read, if you suggest that Bet Shammai's reason for exempting the large sheaf is that its sheer size gives it the same status as a row, why 3 physically distinct sheaves are needed to create a row. So Vilna Gaon comes and modifies this text a little bit, adds a few words in like if. So if you're suggesting. So Vilna Gaon continues, says, how can Bet Shammai, says the Vilna Gaon, justify giving the designation to a single sheaf? In other words, the Gemara's focus is not on the number of sheaves needed to create a row, but rather on the very concept of a large sheaf being considered equivalent to a row of separate sheaves. Vilna Gaon finishes up and says, to this, Gemara replies that Bet Shammai's view, the large sheaf, as if it were actually divided into 4 separate sheaves, which achieves that minimum needed to create a row in Bet Shammai's own view. And this is the explanation of the Vilna Gaon. I want to point out a point by the Rambam on Bet Hillel's point of view. The Rambam in Hilchos Matanos Aniyim, chapter 5, Halacha 17, rules in accordance with Bet Hillel that shchicha applies even to a sheaf that is 4 times as large as the size of the others. He adds, however, that a single sheaf that is larger than 4 of the other sheaves is not subject to shchicha. So, in this, the Ravad points out that it would appear that the Rambam had another version of this Yerushalmi in which the Gemara concludes that Bet Shammai's reason for exempting the 4 calf sheaf is deemed distinctive and is stamped to be remembered. So the Ravad points out that accordingly, the Rambam posits that Bet Hillel argue only in the Mishnah specific case of a sheaf that is 4 times as large as the other sheaves, because they do not consider such a sheaf sufficiently prominent to be exempted from shchicha. They agree, however, that a sheaf that is greater than this size is regarded as distinctive and exempt from shchicha. So perhaps the Rambam had a different view or a different variation of this text, and perhaps the Vilna Gaon did as well. Let's clarify this aspect of Bet Shammai's position, and we're going to finish up. Gemara reads, Rabbi Yonah stated, this 4-to-1 ratio that makes a sheaf of 4 calves exempt from shchicha according to Bet Shammai is the measure for exemption of larger sheaves as well. That is to say, says the Gemara, just as the Mishnah teaches that if all the sheaves of the field are each the size of 1 calf, and one is the size of 4 calves, and the harvester forgot that unusually large one, Bet Shammai says that it is not shchicha. So too, says the Gemara, if all the sheaves of the field are each the size of 2 calves, and one is the size of 8 calves, that large one was forgotten, it is not rendered shchicha according to Bet Shammai. According to Bet Shammai, and why would that be? That's because, says the Mara Fulda, that Bet Shammai's rule in our Mishnah that a 4-calf sheaf in a field of 1-calf sheaves is viewed as a group of 4 and thus exempt from shchicha. And so too, an 8-calf sheaf in a field of 2-calf sheaves, which is likewise 4 times as large as the others, is viewed as 4 separate 2-calf sheaves and also exempt. It is unclear why one should have thought to differentiate between these two cases. Here's what the Vilna Gaon says about this and how he's reading it. Vilna Gaon understands Rabbi Yonah to be understanding an inquiry in his note 1 in his book, in Bure. And he's amending the beginning of this question to read, so he's fixing the text also, and he says, to make it read, what would Bet Shammai hold in a case where all the sheaves of the field are each the size of 1/2 calf, and one is the size of 2 calves, and the large one was forgotten. So he's rewriting the text, and it's going to basically say that according to this text, says the Vilna Gaon, Rabbi Yonah was asking whether Bet Shammai's exception of a sheaf that is 4 times the size of the others is applicable when the sheaves are smaller than the ones mentioned in the Mishnah. Pnei Moshe points out that Rabbi Yonah is presenting a definitive statement rather than an inquiry. And another way to read this is that the Yerushalmi is normally going to use the term ke'eh to note a fixed ruling when it's noting a fixed ruling, but this reading doesn't have that. So you could interpret this, says the Pnei Moshe, as an unanswered question. So this could be, a question that basically Rabbi Yonah is asking a question about this, about the different size to see, and that it's an unanswered question. Perhaps that's why the Vilna Gaon adapts it and is having it, fit to ask whether Bet Shammai's exemption would also be if there's 4 times as large, but for a smaller quantity than he's mentioning. The Gemara here is a little bit hard to understand in the end because maybe it's an incomplete text, which is why the Vilna Gaon's modifying a little bit. And some of the normal terminology that's used for when you have when the Yerushalmi is making a conclusion to have a fixed ruling is missing. That Ba'ai statement, which comes when they're making a fixed ruling, that's not here. So, that's probably why the Pnei Moshe is pointing out that it's really an unanswered inquiries, an unanswered question. Anyway, this concludes for chapter 1, and we're going to get into Halacha 2 tomorrow. Thank you so much.